He called me financially useless and left me for my assistant, thinking he was upgrading his life. What he didn't know? I had silently sold my startup for millions just weeks before. Hi, I'm Evelyn Parker, and this is the story of how betrayal turned into the best thing that ever happened to me. He thought I was broken. He thought I was desperate. But when the divorce was finalized, I walked away a millionaire, while he walked straight into his biggest mistake. What would you have done in my shoes? Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you believe karma always finds its way. I still remember the moment Blake looked me in the eye and called me financially useless. 3 simple words, sharp, brutal, and laced with the kind of arrogance only a man who believed he was trading up could muster. I sat there, divorce papers spread before me on my glass desk, my fingers gripping the edge as if the world beneath me had suddenly tilted. The words jumped out at me like a slap. Irreconcilable differences, failure to contribute meaningfully to the marriage. My stomach churned as I read the cold, calculated phrases. Blake Monroe, my husband of 5 years, had wasted no time cutting me loose. He'd already moved out of our shared home, already parading his new prize, Vanessa Carter, my assistant, around town like she was some sort of trophy. And the irony? He had no idea that while he was plotting his grand escape, I was finalizing the biggest deal of my life. I had sold my tech startup for $800 million. But I wasn't going to tell him that. Not yet. Silicon Valley was a beast, a high-stakes world of innovation, ambition, and relentless competition. It was a place where men like Blake thrived, powerful, confident, always one deal away from their next big break. He loved the money, the status, the idea of success, but he had never understood what I did. While he was busy flipping real estate and hosting lavish cocktail parties for investors, I was in my office, building something real. My company, Parker Analytics, had pioneered AI-driven market analysis, technology that hedge funds, banks, and even government agencies were clamoring to get their hands on. Blake had always dismissed it. "Your little project," he would say with an amused smirk. "Playing with computers won't pay the bills, Evelyn." I had let it slide for years, smiled through the condescension, believed that maybe he just didn't get it. Maybe one day he would. That day never came. Instead, he had walked into my office a month ago with Vanessa on his arm, his voice smooth and businesslike as he delivered the news. "Evelyn, I think it's time we both move on. This marriage isn't working." Vanessa had stood beside him, her freshly manicured fingers wrapped around his wrist. She wasn't even pretending to be apologetic. She'd already moved into the penthouse I picked out, already started wearing the diamond bracelet he had once given me. And now, here I was, staring at the legal confirmation of my removal from his life. I exhaled slowly, pushing back the wave of anger that threatened to consume me. This wasn't the time for emotion. If there was one thing I had learned in business, it was that revenge was best served quietly, efficiently, and with a long-term strategy. Blake thought he was winning. He thought he had outplayed me. He had no idea I was about to rewrite the rules of the game. I glanced toward the glass walls of my office. Beyond them, my team worked as if it were any other day. Rows of engineers, analysts, and executives sat at their desks, lost in numbers and code. They had no idea that in less than 48 hours, Parker Analytics would officially be acquired. But I wasn't just watching my employees. I was watching Vanessa. She sat at her desk just outside my office, scrolling through her phone, a smirk playing on her lips. She had been acting strange lately. Longer lunches, mysterious phone calls, a sudden interest in our company's financials, and today, a new Hermes handbag. Vanessa wasn't subtle. She never had been. And the more I watched her, the more the pieces began to click into place. She hadn't just stolen my husband. She was after something bigger. I reached for my pen, staring down at the divorce papers one last time. Blake wanted a quick, clean break. He believed I was financially dependent on him. He believed I would sign these papers, walk away with whatever settlement he deemed appropriate, and disappear. He didn't know I had already secured my future, my company, and my fortune. And what's more, he didn't know that Vanessa had already started setting him up. 6 months ago, I had started noticing things, little things. Vanessa had begun asking questions, the kind that had nothing to do with scheduling meetings or managing my inbox. So, how does our AI algorithm determine high-value stocks? If someone wanted to invest before a trend is public knowledge, would that be possible? At first, I thought it was just idle curiosity, but then came the increased spending, the secret meetings, the sudden career pivot. Vanessa didn't just want Blake. She wanted inside information. And Blake? He was too blinded by greed and arrogance to see it. I pressed the pen to the paper, signing my name in a deliberate, steady stroke. Evelyn Parker. This was it. The official end of my marriage, and the official beginning of something far more satisfying. I closed the folder, locking the divorce papers away in my desk. Then I opened my laptop, pulling up the final acquisition documents for Parker Analytics. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into our boardroom, sign the final contracts, and officially hand over my company for a price that would set me up for generations. Blake would wake up next to Vanessa, completely unaware that the financially useless wife he had discarded was now one of the wealthiest women in Silicon Valley. And Vanessa? She would keep spinning her web, whispering sweet promises in his ear, leading him toward whatever elaborate financial scheme she had planned. I could have warned him, but why would I? Some lessons are best learned the hard way. Walking into the Parker Analytics headquarters in Palo Alto that morning, I felt it immediately. The shift. The air was different, thick with unspoken words and wary glances. Betrayal was no longer just a wound on my personal life. It was seeping into my company, infecting it from the inside. The state-of-the-art office, with its sleek glass walls, minimalist design, and the hum of high-powered workstations, had always been a place of energy and innovation. Now, it felt like a battlefield. I had spent years cultivating this empire, built it from the ground up. And now, as I moved through the hallways, my heels clicking against polished marble, I could feel it trembling beneath my feet. I wasn't just fighting for my dignity anymore. I was fighting for survival. From the outside, Parker Analytics looked like a fortress, unshakable, successful, an industry leader in AI-driven market predictions. Investors saw strength, competitors saw fear. But from the inside, cracks were forming, and I could see the fault lines clearer than ever. Through the glass partitions, I watched my employees, heads bent over monitors, fingers flying across keyboards. Some were focused, others weren't. In the past, I had never paid much attention to the subtle shifts in body language, the fleeting whispers by the coffee machine, the sudden quiet when I walked into a room. But now I noticed everything. And at the center of it all was Vanessa Carter. She sat at her desk just outside my office, her long blonde hair draped effortlessly over one shoulder, a soft smile playing at her lips as she scrolled through her phone. Too comfortable, too confident. Her rise had been meteoric. Just 2 years ago, she had been an eager assistant, bringing me coffee and taking notes in meetings. Now she carried herself like someone who had secured her place at the top. But I knew better. I had built this company. I knew who truly belonged here and who was merely playing a game. And I had no doubt. Vanessa was playing. That morning, as I settled into my office, my inbox pinged. A new email from Ethan Clark, my CFO. Subject, URGENT, discrepancies in financial reports. I clicked it open. My pulse quickened. Evelyn, I need to bring something to your attention before our next board meeting. There have been some irregularities in our expense reports, unusual movement of funds, inconsistencies in approval processes. I ran a quiet audit. Nothing confirmed yet, but some transactions trace back to Vanessa's department. We should discuss before this escalates. Ethan? I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. So it begins. It wasn't just paranoia. Something was happening, and Vanessa was at the center of it. For the rest of the morning, I kept my distance. I watched. I listened. Every muttered conversation, every flicker of unease in my employees' faces became a piece of the puzzle. Alice Reed, my legal counsel, caught my eye during our leadership meeting. A silent nod. She'd seen the same things I had. Blake, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. The coward was probably basking in his newfound freedom, oblivious to the fire he had set. But Vanessa, she was here, still playing her part, still making moves, still believing she was untouchable. I wasn't ready to make my move yet, not without solid proof. So I did what I did best. I strategized. That afternoon, I sent Alice and Ethan a simple message. Gather everything you can quietly. This isn't just about numbers anymore, it's about control. If Vanessa was stealing from me, if she was setting up her own scheme under my roof, I would find out. And when I did, she would regret ever thinking she could outplay me. By late afternoon, the tension in the office had thickened. People felt the shift. It happened during a leadership meeting, one of those routine, sterile gatherings where people spoke in polished corporate lingo, carefully curating their words. Except today, something changed. Vanessa was speaking, confident, poised, too polished. I wasn't even listening to her words. I was watching her movements, the slight flicker in her eyes when she glanced at her phone, the way she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before answering a simple question. And then it happened. A document flashed across the screen, a confidential financial file. It was subtle, a flicker of recognition in Vanessa's expression. She knew exactly what it was before anyone else did, and in that instant, I knew. She had been inside the system. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. Our eyes met across the conference table. For the first time, I saw fear in hers. Good. I didn't call her out. Not yet. Instead, I let the moment stretch. Let her feel the weight of my gaze. Let her wonder just how much I knew. Then I smiled. Not the polite corporate kind. The kind that said, I see you and I'm coming for you. Vanessa's back stiffened ever so slightly. Game on. That evening, as I locked my office, I finalized my next move. Vanessa thought she had the upper hand. She thought Blake had chosen her, that she had replaced me. But what she didn't know? Blake was just as disposable to her as she was to him, and she was walking straight into a trap of her own making. I walked out of the office that night, my heart no longer heavy with anger, but burning with purpose. Tomorrow I would start digging deeper. Tomorrow I would uncover every secret she was hiding. Tomorrow, the game would truly begin. I sat alone in my home office, the soft hum of my laptop the only sound in the room. The rest of the house was dark, silent, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts raging in my mind. The email that had just landed in my inbox felt like a match striking dry kindling, setting fire to every doubt and suspicion I had carried for weeks. It was confirmation. Confirmation that I hadn't been imagining things. Confirmation that Blake and Vanessa weren't just careless opportunists, but deliberate, calculating thieves. The email was unsigned, anonymous, but its contents were damning. Evidence of financial manipulation, unauthorized access to sensitive data, transactions that shouldn't exist. Someone had tried to cover their tracks, but they weren't thorough enough, and I was done pretending. I clicked open the first document attachment. As the numbers and signatures scrolled across my screen, my stomach twisted. This wasn't just a mistake or a technical glitch. This was premeditated. Blake had never cared about my company, but now I knew he had been watching, waiting until I had built something valuable enough to steal. And Vanessa? She had been feeding him insider knowledge, giving him the tools to make his move. I closed my eyes, inhaling sharply. They really thought I wouldn't notice. They thought they had won. They thought I was too broken to fight back. They were wrong. My fingers flew across the keyboard as I dug deeper, scanning logs, tracking patterns. The digital paper trail was messy but clear. Vanessa had been accessing confidential files she had no business looking at. It had started subtly, minor reports, small bits of market data, but as time went on, she had gotten bolder, too bold. One file stood out, a confidential acquisition document. I clicked it open, feeling my pulse quicken. It was a preliminary draft, an early-stage valuation of Parker Analytics, a file that only a handful of people, including myself, should have had access to. Vanessa had downloaded it 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. That was before Blake had even served me the divorce papers. They had been planning this before he left me. That realization sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through me. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was orchestrated, calculated down to the finest detail. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to focus. I couldn't afford to get emotional. Not now. I needed to be smarter, sharper. I wasn't just going to stop them. I was going to destroy them. I picked up my phone and dialed. Alice answered on the second ring. "Tell me," she said, skipping the pleasantries. "I have proof," I replied, my voice steady despite the fury burning underneath. "Vanessa's been inside our systems. She accessed acquisition files, ones that only senior executives should have been able to see." Silence stretched between us before Alice exhaled. "Then it's worse than we thought." "I'm cutting her off," I said. "Tonight." "Are you sure that's the right move?" she asked cautiously. "If she realizes she's locked out, she'll know you're onto her." "She already suspects I know something," I muttered, glancing toward the glowing screen, "and I refuse to give her another second of access." Alice hesitated, then sighed. "All right, do it. But be prepared for fallout. She won't go quietly." I smirked. "She never does." It took me less than 5 minutes to shut her out. With a few keystrokes, I revoked her credentials. Any attempt she made to access our internal systems would now redirect to a monitored dummy account, one that would track every desperate move she made. I leaned back, exhaling. A small victory, but not the war. Because as much as I wanted to believe Vanessa had been acting alone, I knew better. Blake was involved, and if Vanessa had been stealing information, that meant Blake was already using it. I checked the time. 2:43 a.m. I should have been exhausted, but I wasn't, because I knew that in a few hours, Vanessa was going to walk into the office, sit down at her desk, and realize she had just lost her only advantage. And soon after that, she and Blake were going to learn something else. They had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost them everything. The tension in the office was palpable. It started as whispers, hushed conversations in break rooms, stolen glances in the hallways, an unspoken awareness that something big was happening. By mid-morning, the whispers had turned into an undeniable current of panic. I walked into the building, my heels echoing against the polished marble floors, my presence met with nervous eyes that quickly looked away. They knew. Something had shifted overnight. The air was thick with anticipation, fear, and uncertainty. I strode past Vanessa's desk without acknowledging her. I didn't need to. She felt my presence. I could sense it. She was tense. Good. By the time I reached my office, Alice was already there, her arms crossed, a hard look on her face. Ethan stood beside her, his expression grim. "Close the door," I said, dropping my bag onto the desk. Alice locked it behind her. "It's worse than we thought." I exhaled, bracing myself. "How bad?" Ethan slid a folder across the table. "This just came in. A source inside the finance department leaked it. It's all here. Financial manipulation, unauthorized transfers, backdoor deals. Blake and Vanessa weren't just sneaking around. They were stealing." I flipped the folder open, my eyes scanning the pages. My stomach tightened. There it was, in black and white, the confirmation of what I had suspected all along. Transactions routed through offshore accounts, falsified expense reports, investments made in Blake's name using company assets. It was a blueprint of betrayal, methodical and ruthless. And Vanessa? She had been the architect. My grip on the papers tightened. This wasn't just corporate espionage. This was a crime. Word traveled fast. By noon, the atmosphere had shifted from unease to outright chaos. Employees huddled in corners, speaking in hushed tones. Emails flew back and forth, vague and panicked. The leadership team scrambled to assess the damage, their voices barely concealing the dread settling over them. Inside the boardroom, the tension was thick enough to choke on. I stood at the head of the table, scanning the faces of my senior executives. Some were furious, others were frightened, and a few looked guilty. Vanessa sat at the far end, her posture stiff, her hands clasped together in her lap. She avoided my gaze. Smart move. I cleared my throat and the room fell silent. "The documents in front of you," I said, my voice sharp and controlled, "detail fraudulent financial activity linked directly to Blake Monroe and Vanessa Carter." A ripple of shock ran through the room. Vanessa's face paled. She knew she had lost control. Ethan leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "These aren't just accounting errors. This is deliberate fraud, unauthorized wire transfers, investments made under false pretenses. Someone was using our resources to fund their own ambitions." A murmur spread through the table. I turned my gaze to Vanessa, letting the weight of the moment sink in. "You want to say something?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. She licked her lips, forced a weak smile. This is a misunderstanding. I don't know what—" "Enough," I interrupted, my patience shattered. "The evidence is overwhelming, and if you think I'll let this slide, you don't know me at all." Silence. A suffocating silence. Vanessa's fingers trembled as she reached for her pen, tapping it nervously against the table. For the first time, she looked afraid. And Blake? He wasn't here. Coward. He had left her to face this alone. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. By the time I called for a vote, the room was divided. Half wanted to bury the scandal to protect the company's public image. The other half? They wanted justice. I wanted justice. I stood, letting my chair scrape against the floor. "There's no hiding this," I said, my voice steady but laced with steel. "Not anymore. Not when people's livelihoods are at stake. Not when trust has been shattered. We take this to the authorities. Today." A murmur of unease. A few exchanged looks. But no one objected. Alice, sitting beside me, nodded firmly. "We file the reports," she said. "We protect this company the right way." The final nail in Vanessa's coffin. She sagged back in her chair, her composure cracking under the weight of the decision. Her eyes met mine, pleading. I didn't blink. She had made her choices. Now she would face the consequences. An hour later, the damage control had begun. I ordered immediate security overhauls. Every access point Vanessa had used was locked down. Every compromised system was being audited. No one would be able to cover their tracks now. I watched from my office as employees whispered, as news of the scandal spread like wildfire. Blake was next. I picked up my phone, dialing his number. It rang once, twice, straight to voicemail. Of course. Coward. I smiled to myself, tossing my phone onto my desk. He wouldn't be able to run for long, because as of this afternoon, his name was in an official fraud report, and the authorities? They were coming for him next. As I sat back, rubbing my temples, a thought lingered in my mind. How deep did this conspiracy really go? Blake and Vanessa had started this game, believing they had outsmarted me. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I exhaled, my pulse steady, my mind sharper than ever. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin, and I would be ready. I remember the exact moment the ground shifted beneath me, the moment everything changed. The knock on the glass doors of Parker Analytics was sharp, deliberate. 2 men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence alone enough to send a shockwave through the office. Employees exchanged wary glances, voices dropped to hurried whispers. Then, the words that made my pulse slow, my stomach tighten. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to speak with Ms. Parker immediately. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. The moment Blake and Vanessa's sins would finally come to light. The law office where the meeting took place was cold and impersonal. The conference room, all glass and chrome, reflected the stark contrast between the high-powered world of business and the ugly truth lurking underneath. Alice sat beside me, composed as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Ethan was across the table, his face unreadable. Blake, however, looked hollowed out. His once polished confidence had been replaced by something else, something close to panic. Vanessa wasn't here. Typical. She had always been smart enough to stay out of the direct line of fire. The lead investigator wasted no time. Ms. Parker, we're conducting an official inquiry into allegations of financial fraud and internal manipulation at Parker Analytics. His gaze flickered toward Blake. And we believe key individuals within your organization are involved. Blake shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening. He knew exactly what that meant. So did I. The house of cards was collapsing, and this time, I was the one standing on solid ground. The hours that followed were a blur of legal briefings, evidence reviews, and tense conversations. Emails were dissected, financial records pored over, every shady transaction, every unauthorized data transfer, every single move Blake and Vanessa had made was dragged into the light. I sat through it all, silent, calculating, watching Blake squirm, watching as the reality of his downfall settled over him. At one point, he finally turned to me, his voice lower than I had ever heard it. "Evelyn," he started, but I didn't let him finish. I leveled my gaze at him, voice steady. "Don't. Not now. Not ever." Whatever he had to say, whatever excuses or pathetic attempts at justification he wanted to make, they didn't matter. Not anymore. Back at Parker Analytics, the tension had reached a breaking point. People were afraid. They knew what was happening, and they knew what it meant. When I walked into the boardroom that afternoon, the room was charged, a silent electric storm waiting to break. I stood at the head of the table, scanning the faces in front of me. Some were loyal, some were unsure, and some had been complicit. "The truth is out," I said, my voice cutting through the uneasy silence. "There's no more denying it, no more hiding." I turned toward the massive screen behind me. With a single click, the damning evidence filled the display. Transaction records, email chains, communications Blake and Vanessa thought they had erased. Gasps filled the room. Someone swore under their breath. I let the moment sink in before I continued. This company was built on trust and innovation, and now, because of greed and betrayal, our very foundation has been threatened. I looked directly at the individuals who had stood by Blake, who had enabled this mess. This is your one and only chance to decide where you stand. Do you stand with the truth? I paused, then added, or do you fall with them? Silence. Then, one by one, hands began to fold. Heads began to lower. The divide was clear. And at that moment, Blake Monroe was officially a man without allies. The fallout was swift and brutal. Legal teams were deployed. Security protocols were tightened overnight. Access was revoked. Positions were terminated. Blake's accounts were frozen. Vanessa, gone. She had vanished before the full weight of the scandal could crush her. She'd always been good at escaping. But I knew better than to believe she had disappeared for good. People like Vanessa never truly disappear. They regroup. They scheme. They wait. And when she resurfaced, I would be ready. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring out at the city's skyline. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. Because the truth was, winning didn't come without a price. I had fought. I had exposed the lies, and I had taken back control. But what had I lost in the process? My company was intact, but my trust, my faith in the people I had once believed in, that was gone. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. Tomorrow there would be more battles to fight, more damage to contain. The war wasn't over. Not yet. But for now, I had won the first round, and that was enough for tonight. Stepping into the courtroom that day felt like entering a battlefield. The air was thick with tension, the kind that pressed down on your chest, making every breath feel like an effort. The gallery was packed. Journalists, industry insiders, and former colleagues who had come to witness the fallout. Some looked at me with sympathy, others with thinly veiled curiosity, but most were here for the spectacle. I walked past the rows of seated onlookers, head held high, refusing to let them see anything but strength. Blake and Vanessa sat at the defense table, their once glossy confidence fraying at the edges. Blake's suit was crisp, his posture perfect, but his face? It told a different story. He was pale, restless, shifting slightly every few minutes as though he couldn't quite get comfortable. Vanessa, on the other hand, was eerily composed. She sat with her hands clasped on the table, expression carefully neutral, but I caught it. The flicker of unease behind her eyes. She wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. The judge entered, and the courtroom hushed. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced, and just like that, the battle began. The prosecution started strong. They outlined every piece of fraud, every financial misstep, every deceitful maneuver Blake and Vanessa had orchestrated. My company's financial records, once pristine, had been weaponized for their personal greed. I sat in silence as the prosecutor tore them apart piece by piece. Emails were displayed, bank statements examined, contracts scrutinized. Every damning detail was laid bare for the world to see. Alice and Ethan had done their jobs well. They had spent weeks preparing for this moment. And now, as witness after witness testified, the case against Blake and Vanessa tightened like a noose. And then, the moment no one expected, a surprise witness. The prosecution called a name I didn't recognize at first. A man in his early 40s took the stand, his sharp navy suit giving off the distinct impression of someone with power. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said. "Jonathan Cross," the man replied smoothly. I turned toward Alice, who met my gaze with a knowing nod. Who was he? I didn't have to wait long for the answer. Jonathan Cross was a former investor, someone who had dealt with Blake before Blake had ever met me, and he had a story to tell. Under oath, Cross detailed a long history of questionable financial dealings, illicit investments, offshore transfers, deals that were meant to be hidden. "This isn't the first time Mr. Monroe is engaged in fraud," Cross stated, his voice cutting through the courtroom. "He's been running the same playbook for years. This time, he just got caught." The revelation was devastating. The defense scrambled. Blake's attorney objected, tried to downplay the testimony, but it was too late. The damage was done. I turned to look at Blake. He was staring at the witness, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Vanessa sat frozen beside him, her carefully crafted mask beginning to crumble. And then I realized something. She hadn't known. She had thought she was Blake's only partner in crime. She had thought she was in control. But Blake had been playing her too. The defense fought back. Blake's lawyer tried to paint him as a misunderstood businessman, someone who had taken risks that didn't pan out. But the jury wasn't buying it. Not after what Cross had just revealed. Then came Vanessa's turn. She took the stand, her voice carefully measured, her answers rehearsed. "I had no knowledge of fraudulent activity," she claimed, her expression unwavering. "I was simply following orders." Lies. The prosecutor, unfazed, leaned in. "Then explain these emails," he said, clicking a button. On the screen, Vanessa's own digital footprint betrayed her. Emails she had sent, files she had accessed, transactions she had approved. There was no way out. For the first time, I saw it. True fear in her eyes. And it was glorious. Then came my moment. I took the stand, my heart steady, my voice strong. The prosecutor led me through the timeline, allowing me to lay out exactly how I had built Parker Analytics from nothing, how I had trusted Blake, how I had been betrayed. Then he asked, "What do you want the jury to understand about this case?" I looked directly at them. "This isn't just about numbers," I said, my voice unwavering. "It's about greed. It's about trust being shattered. It's about people who believe they can take and take without consequences." I let my words hang in the air. Blake looked down. Vanessa clenched her hands. I turned back to the jury. I refused to let them walk away from this, and I refused to let anyone else become their next victims. The silence that followed was absolute. The judge adjourned the court for the day, and I walked out feeling lighter. Not because the fight was over, it wasn't, but because I knew, without a doubt, that I was winning. That night, I sat in my office staring at the city lights. Justice was finally within reach. But one thought lingered. What if Vanessa had one last move left to play? Because something told me, deep in my gut, this wasn't over yet. In the quiet after the storm of the courtroom, I found myself staring at the glass walls of my office, watching the fractured reflection of my own face. For months, I had been in survival mode, battling fires from every direction, betrayal, scandal, destruction. Now that the dust had settled, I expected to feel victorious, relieved even, but all I felt was the weight of what remained. Walking through Parker Analytics, the tension was still thick in the air. Employees worked in near silence, their eyes glued to their screens, their hushed conversations charged with uncertainty. Blake and Vanessa were gone, stripped of their power, disgraced, facing the full force of the legal system. Their empire of deceit had collapsed under its own greed. But what about us? What about the company I had spent years building? I could still see the cracks left behind. Some were obvious: empty offices where key executives once sat, conference rooms once filled with confidence now carrying the weight of doubt. Others were more subtle. The way employees hesitated before speaking up, the way trust had been eroded by the very people who were supposed to lead. And now, it was up to me to fix it. The official court ruling came through that morning. Blake Monroe, guilty of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Sentencing was still ahead, but his fate was sealed. Vanessa Carter, convicted of aiding and abetting fraud, lesser charges due to her cooperation, but her career was effectively over. The headlines were brutal. Tech mogul falls from grace. Blake Monroe found guilty in high-profile fraud case. Parker Analytics scandal ends with convictions. CEO Evelyn Parker emerges victorious. Victory. That's what they were calling it. But winning doesn't erase the damage. The fallout was far from over. Inside the boardroom, Alice and Ethan sat across from me, their eyes filled with a mix of exhaustion and cautious hope. "We need to address the employees first," Alice said, her voice steady. "They need to hear from you directly." I nodded, already knowing she was right. Ethan leaned forward. "Investors are still wary. We need to present a clear strategy. We have to show them that Parker Analytics isn't just surviving. We're evolving." That was the real challenge, not just putting out the fires, but rebuilding stronger than before. That afternoon, I stood before my employees. The office was packed. Some stood in the hallways, some leaned against desks, all of them watching me. I took a deep breath and spoke. "I know the past few months have shaken us. We've been tested, betrayed, and forced to question everything we believed about this company and the people leading it." Silence. A room full of wounded trust waiting to hear what came next. "But today," I continued, "we make a choice. We choose whether Parker Analytics becomes a company defined by the mistakes of others or by the resilience of the people still standing." I paused, looking at their faces, some hopeful, some skeptical. The people in this room are the ones who kept going when things got hard, who chose to stay and fight for something real. I won't lie to you. We have work to do. We have reputation to rebuild, trust to earn back, and an entirely new future to shape. But we are still here, and as long as we're still here, we are not finished. A murmur spread through the room, a shift, a flicker of belief. For the first time in months, I felt it too. We weren't just trying to survive anymore. We were about to rebuild. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change. Vanessa's access had been revoked long ago, but now we completely overhauled our security protocols. No one, not even top executives, would have unchecked access again. New leadership appointments were made. We prioritized integrity over power, and most importantly, we reinstated transparency at every level. No more closed doors, no more secrets. One evening, as I sat in my office, Alice knocked on the glass door. "Ready for the final investor briefing?" she asked. I turned away from the city skyline, nodding. "Let's do this." She hesitated, then smirked. "For the record, I think you're insane for pushing through all of this so fast." "Probably," I admitted. "Most people would have walked away," she added, folding her arms. I held her gaze. "Most people didn't build this company from nothing." She nodded once. "Then let's remind them why Parker Analytics is still standing." The meeting was packed. Investors, stakeholders, analysts, all watching, waiting to see if we would sink or swim. I walked to the front, placed my hands on the podium, and owned the moment. "We don't ignore the past," I said. "We don't pretend it didn't happen. We learn from it. We adapt, and we come back stronger than before." I outlined the new structure, the new security measures, the innovations already in the pipeline. I painted a future that was unshaken by the mistakes of the past. By the end of the meeting, I saw the shift. They weren't just skeptical investors anymore. They were believers, because no matter how brutal the fall, we were proving we could rise. That night, I sat alone in my office, the weight of it all finally settling in. Had I done enough? Would Parker Analytics truly recover? Would I? The scars of betrayal don't fade overnight. But as I looked out at the city lights, I realized something. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't just looking at the wreckage of what had been destroyed. I was looking at the future I was about to build. And this time, no one would take it from me. I woke up to the golden sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new penthouse, casting long shadows across the sleek, wooden floors. The air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of the San Francisco skyline below, a stark contrast to the chaos I had endured over the past year. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. I stretched, stepping barefoot onto the cool marble tiles of the balcony, gazing out at the city. This was my fresh start, not just in business, but in life. The storm was over, and I had survived. The final court rulings had closed the book on Blake and Vanessa, Blake Monroe, sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for financial fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. The judge had been unforgiving, citing his repeated offenses and sheer arrogance in believing he could manipulate the system without consequence. Vanessa Carter, a reduced sentence in exchange for cooperation. She had played her part well, throwing Blake under the bus the moment it became clear he couldn't save her. But her career? Over. Their names had faded from the industry, nothing more than cautionary tales of greed and self-destruction. And me? I had moved on. The company had emerged from the ashes, stronger, sharper, unshaken. I had rebuilt Parker Analytics from the inside out. New leadership, new ethics policies, new security measures that ensured no one would ever be able to exploit my business again. Investors had returned, confidence slowly restored. And today was the day we would show the world exactly what Parker Analytics had become. The event hall was packed. Journalists, tech innovators, investors, former employees, everyone who had doubted me, everyone who had whispered behind closed doors, wondering if I'd survive. I stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding for a brief moment. Then, the hush. The world was waiting. I let them. I took a deep breath, the weight of the past year settling in my chest. Then I spoke. Parker Analytics has always been built on one thing: vision. A vision for innovation, for integrity, for a future where technology serves not just profits, but people. I scanned the crowd, making sure they felt the gravity of my words. We were tested. We were broken. We were betrayed. I paused, but we are still here. And today, we take our next step forward, stronger than ever. A massive screen behind me flickered to life, revealing our newest project, a cutting-edge AI-driven system designed to revolutionize global market analytics. Faster, smarter, impossible to manipulate, a direct answer to the deception that had once threatened to destroy us. The applause was deafening. I smiled, letting the sound wash over me, not because I needed validation, but because I had already won. That night, back at my penthouse, I poured a glass of wine and let myself breathe. Alice and Ethan sat across from me, their expressions lighter than they had been in months. "Well," Alice smirked, raising her glass. "You did it." Ethan chuckled. "Not just did it, you turned a disaster into an empire." I clinked my glass against theirs. "Here's to never letting anyone define us again." They nodded, but I could see the unspoken questions lingering. What next? Where do I go from here? For the first time, I didn't feel the need to rush for an answer, because the future was wide open. And for once, I was exactly where I was meant to be. As I stood on the balcony later that night, watching the city lights flicker below, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. Blake was gone. Vanessa was a shadow of the past. My company was stronger than ever. And me, I had proven to the world and to myself that I was never financially useless. I was unstoppable. I smiled, raising my glass toward the night sky. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. As I stand here today, looking back on everything I've endured, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the relentless battle for justice, I realize that my story isn't just about me. It's about all of us. It's about every person who has ever been underestimated, cast aside, or told they weren't good enough. It's about those who have been betrayed by the very people they trusted the most. And it's about what happens when we refuse to let the darkness define us. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Success isn't about proving your doubters wrong. It's about proving yourself right. There will always be people who try to diminish you, who tell you that you're not capable, that you're not worthy, that your dreams are too big. Let them talk. Let them doubt. Because in the end, the greatest revenge is not just success. It's living a life so full, so powerful that their opinions become irrelevant. I won't lie to you. Starting over is hard. Trusting again is even harder. But the thing about resilience, it's not something you're born with. It's something you build piece by piece every time life tries to break you. And here's the truth. You are stronger than you think. So tell me, what's your story? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to rise from the ashes? Have you ever had to fight for what was yours, even when the odds were against you? Drop a 1 in the comments if this story resonated with you. Or tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. And if you didn't like this video, tell me why. Let's talk about it. Most importantly, if you want more stories like this, real stories of resilience, power, and redemption, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, the best is yet to come. Until next time, keep fighting for yourself. No one else will do it for you.